year we restored the 65 Shelby. The year before that we did the Hemi Challenger. The year before that we did the Baldwin Motion Camaro. This year we thought we'd do this 69 L88 car, a Corvette, a fiberglass car, a whole new bunch of techniques for restoration, a whole new bunch of ideas for you guys to take home and use in your own garage. This car here is a 1969 L88, one of 116 built, both coupes and convertibles, probably one of the ultimate Corvettes. Well, when we first got this restoration, unlike some, a lot of times they get delivered to us in baskets, this one here was a really nice run and driving car. At first we thought we'd wash and wax it, send it back to the customer, and then we got looking a little bit closer. And what we found is the paint's really starting to crack all over the hood. It's starting to spiderweb. Around the edges of the fiberglass, especially in some of the corners here, it's starting to crack. It needs to be stripped. Some of the components on the car, although are 99%, we've got a few small problems. If you look at the convertible top here, there's a mark in the middle of it. And it really doesn't matter if it's got a slice through the whole center of the top or if it's got this mark. If it's going to be a complete ground-up restoration, show car quality, that means that that has to be replaced. Same thing with the chrome plating on the rear bumper. The rear bumpers are 90% there, but there's a bunch of pit, there's a bunch of marks, it's fairly wavy. This car is going to be a show car. The other thing we talk to is the customer and see what are the parameters he wants for this car. What's it going to do when it's finished? Is this car going to be an NCRS top flight car? Is it going to go to Bloomington? Is it going to be a street car? Well, when Larry talked to us about this car, he had this idea that he wants a top flight looking car, but he also wants it to perform better. Can you imagine that? Perform better than an original L88 car. So what we decided to do is build a stroker motor, do some suspension modifications, and make sure that this car quality-wise is as good as it's going to get. We're going to put all the markings on it. We're going to do it like an NCRS top flight car, but we're going to enhance it a little bit. And that's what the customer wants. That's what the customer's paying for, so that's what the customer will get. Now, this car here, because it is complete, running and driving, we get the opportunity to check out some things before we start the restoration. The reason we're taking this car for a test drive is when the car comes to us complete, it gives us the opportunity to make sure all the gauges are working. If we take it apart and we didn't check it beforehand, we didn't know what worked and what didn't work. There's no point sending out the tack if it works just fine. If we have a look here, the speedo seems fairly accurate, the tack seems fairly accurate. The gauges are moving. We've got water temperature just starting to come up. The oil pressure is good. The ammeter's working. The fuel gauge seems to be working. Even all the lights in the dash are working. That's really good. It saves us time during the restoration. The clock is the only thing really that's noticeably not working. Now, if we go to the wiper assembly, we check that because these are all vacuum run. Quite often these things don't work so well. We turned on the wipers, they're working. They go back down. And the hood comes back down on it as well. Same thing with the lights. You want to check the lights. They work off vacuum. These ones here popped up nice. This car here is actually a very good running car. When we pulled this car out of the shop, we noticed that a puddle of oil. Looks like the rear main could be leaking. So generally that isn't a big deal. We're doing the motor anyway on this thing, and Larry wants us to build a stroker motor, but we want to check the block and the main cap itself, make sure there's not an issue there, a crack there. So this test drive is really to try and diagnose any existing problems that would help us with the restoration. When we get back, we're going to go through the rest of the car and make some notes. Actually, a pretty nice driving car. Now, there's a couple things we did notice on the drive. One, the clock doesn't work. Secondly, the side glass is fairly scratched, so we're going to have to address that. We're going to have to get some date-coated glass for this thing. Now, under the hood, the parameters are, it has to look original. We can't use a set of aftermarket heads or an aftermarket block. He wants it to look like a stock L88, but with somewhere around 600 horsepower, 600 foot-pounds of torque. We're going to do that with a stroker piece. Well, the next stage is to totally dismantle this car, and that's what we're going to do between now and next week. And then we're also going to take it and start stripping the paint and seeing if there's any surprises in the body. By the looks of the rest of this car, I don't think we're in for any surprises. I think it's going to be a relatively easy restoration, but we are going to have some fun doing the performance modifications that Larry wants. Well, Jason and the guys have been hard at work pulling apart the L88 Corvette, and this year it's a full frame car, as everybody knows a Corvette is. Last year, the 65 Shelby, it's a unibody car, so when we made the jig or the dolly to roll it around on, we didn't have to be as particular. This time, the jig or dolly is actually supporting the body the way the frame would, so we had to do it very strong, make sure it doesn't flex. Plus, we made all the mounts adjustable so we could actually adjust the body the way we would on a frame with shims. Well, most of you know taking the car apart is the easy part. Putting it back together can be a little bit more challenging. But if you get organized at this point in the restoration, it makes life a lot easier later on. What we would do is as every component comes off the car, we would lay it out on the floor. You're going to take up a bit of shop space here, but it's well worth it. Then what we do is we photograph everything, both on the car, off the car. Then we start labeling all the pieces. We also make a bunch of decisions at this point. We would check all the stainless trim, we would check all the chrome, we would check all the upholstery. If the trim needs to go out to get plated, repaired, buffed, whatever, then now's the time to put that all together and make a list of what goes out to the plater. Photograph the entire layout of the chrome on the floor so when it comes back from the plater, you check every piece off so you don't lose anything. Well, now that we got the body organized, we go to the chassis and the drivetrain. And on an L88, it's all about motor and drivetrain. You've got the stamp numbers on the front of the block here. You've got the casting numbers at the rear, and you've got the date code at the rear. Now, there's a bunch of other numbers that are pretty important too. The transmission also comes with the serial number of the car along with the casting numbers. Rear end also has casting numbers on it. Important to document all this now. We photograph it, we write it all down. As the motor comes apart, we also take the head number, we take the intake number, we take the alternator number. We want to make sure as we send out any of these components, we're getting back the original parts. It's a good way to document it if there's any discrepancies later. Another important point is start looking at all the suspension. Now, Larry's decided we're going to go with aftermarket bushings on this car, so it really doesn't matter. The suspension's starting to come apart a little bit on this car, so it's a good time to do it. The frame itself actually looks real nice. Now, what the next step is to get all this stuff taken apart, get it organized, get it put away. The key to a restoration is organization, organization. It'll save you a ton of time and a ton of money later. As I'll show you later on in the show what happens when they come in baskets, sometimes it takes twice as long. So now we're ready to finish stripping this car. It's going to go off to the media blaster and then we'll see if there's any damage. Well, we're back at the pro shop working on the 69 L88 car. Last week we totally disassembled the car. Now we put it on the dolly, we're ready to move it around and get the body stripped, the paint stripped off the body. Now people always ask us, why is it important to strip the paint off the car? Well, there's one main reason is you want to remove all the paint that's checked and crazed. Remember the hood on this car? It was starting to check and craze. The tops of the fenders were starting to crack. Those cracks are coming from right into the fiberglass, and if you don't get all the paint off of it, it's going to come back to haunt us later. A lot of people will spend a little bit extra money at this stage, but it's really worth doing. Now, we had a few options in stripping the paint. You can do it by hand, which is really time consuming. You have to worry about the chemical going into the fiberglass, or you can do it with a blaster like Mike. We ended up opting for the walnut shells.
Walnut shells and a fine grit will do a real good job on aluminum as well as fiberglass, and it won't do any damage to the parts. It can remove the paint and the primer and leave a nice smooth finish.
Well, the whole idea behind Media Blast is to remove the paint and the primer. It's really not going to attack the body filler. So once we get it back from the blaster, we have to remove all of the body filler by hand using a DA. You can see here on the bottom of the rocker, you've got the original maroon, then we've got a yellow primer here, which is probably like a 3+1, and then a high build primer or body filler. And it's really tough to remove that high build or the body filler. You can see a few chunks here. That's going to have to be removed by hand. Well, underneath the car, this car somebody had painted black. That's not the way a Corvette originally came. Corvette came raw fiberglass, sort of a natural look. So in order for us to strip this, we started stripping it, and it got a little bit aggressive and you start seeing the strands, so we backed off. But what we also discovered is you can see some of the original markings here. You have a 44A that somebody put on the assembly line. We're going to duplicate that as we're doing this restoration. We also found a fair bit of damage around the bell housing area and the firewall. And I think what happened, at some point, L88 Corvettes at the drag strip, guy rips a clutch out of it and tears up the whole firewall. The repair has been made, but we're going to have to fix this here because you can see where the two pieces of fiberglass were bonded together and then you lose that whole seam on the fiberglass repair. We're going to have to make that look original again. Now what we did to strip the bottom, because the walnut shells was a little too aggressive to actually get all the paint and sort of undercoating off, is we ended up stripping it by hand. And what we used is some paint stripper and some lacquer thinner and a Scotch-Brite pad, and it gives that original finish underneath this thing so it looks stock. Well, it's not often you get a chance to actually see the bonding strips from underneath the car, but you can clearly see here where the quarter panel, this is the bonding strip, the quarter panel, and the deck lid panel lay over top of the bonding strip, and then there's a thin seam on the outside. Same thing with the taillight panel here. You can see the bonding strip that attaches the top panel to the taillight panel. What you can see here is the taillight panel is one piece, the top or deck panel is another piece, and they butt up against each other, but there's a gap here. Behind this whole section is the bonding strip, and that's exactly what it does, is it bonds these two panels. Then this gap here is filled with bonding adhesive or vet fill, and these seams go all the way around the car. They go around the quarter panels to front fenders, and these panels are actually bonded together, and these seams on great original cars are sunk in. Now some NCRS guys will want to see those seams. This one's already been filled once on the last restoration, and Larry wants this restoration, the body, to be better than it was originally, so we're going to fill these seams in and make it a lot straighter than the way the car was. Now next week we're going to show you about fiberglass repair. All the cracks, all the little areas that were damaged, we're going to show you how to fix those. Well, we're back at Legendary Motorcar, and work's continuing on the '69 L88 Corvette. Now, when we got the car back and got it stripped, we realized that we're dealing with a really nice bodied car. All original panels, never been wrecked. All the steel pieces, no rust in them. Nice, clean body. But there are lots of little stress cracks, lots of little areas that need some attention. One of those areas is typically where the front bumpers would bolt to, and lots of times the bumpers get tapped slightly and they create a stress crack or even create a hole. On this front corner here, what we had to do after we got it back from the blaster is we had to dig out the original body filler, and you V that out with just a little Dremel, and then you keep working on that area until you've got all of the body work out of there. You can't lay fiberglass over top of body filler. You have to get down to the original fiberglass. Once that area is nice and clean, keep blowing it out so you don't have dust in there. You start to lay in the resin. The resin itself bonds to the fiberglass, and then we start laying in strands of fiberglass. Now, as opposed to using a sheet of fiberglass, the strands will attach themselves individually to the existing fiberglass. You get a little bit better repair, especially for a small crack, and you don't get as much fiberglass build. Now, it's really important to keep putting resin on, using the brush, work in the fiberglass, put on more resin, work in some more fiberglass strands, and keep building it up until you're just about even with the top. Then you take a DA and you sand it smooth. Go back to the original step. You'll see a couple little divots in that, lay in some more resin, a little bit more fiberglass. Now on this side, we had another problem. What had happened was there was an earlier repair here, and we saw before we stripped the car that there was actually some cracking going on. The earlier repair was so thin that it just fell in as soon as the panel was stripped, and there was actually a hole here. So the process is now is you have to, again, grind out all the body filler that's in there. You have to put fiberglass on fiberglass. It won't stick to the filler. It won't be a good repair. So they grind out that whole area, make sure it's a nice clean repair, and then you can see you have to have something to fill against, so we back tape it from the inside and start laying in the fiberglass strand again, using resin first, then the fiberglass strand, and just keep repeating that process and repeating the process. Then you have to work the edge of the inside here where the hood butts up against it and do the same thing. Make a sort of pattern with your tape behind it, and then keep working in the fiberglass mat and the resin, and keep trying to get every air pocket out of there. It's a tedious process, but worth it in the end. Now, once you're finished that, you have this rough sort of area here that needs to be shaped. And what you take is a simple DA, 40 grit paper on it, and just keep shaping that area, both on the top surface and the inside surface. The inside, you can use a Dremel to get it nice and round. The top, you want to use the DA. After that's done, we're at the stage that we're at right now. We're actually using vet fill to fill in on the fiberglass repair itself. And you're actually using the vet fill as well to do a little bit of straightening. The fiberglass isn't really straight, and like I said earlier, Larry wants to make this thing better than original, but just not go overboard. So that's the stage we're at now. We'll also fit the panel shortly, and then we'll start the polysurfacer process and the blocking out process. Well, the guys at Legendary Motorcar have been working hard on Larry's L88 Corvette. Now, a fiberglass car creates some interesting problems, which we've got some solutions for. Now, a fiberglass car is just that, strands of glass that are put together with a bunch of different types of resins. Now, that resin actually starts to shrink, and quite often you'll see these lines or spider webs going through fiberglass, and what that is the resin is shrinking back, leaving the strands of glass exposed. Now, what we have to do is put something on top of that that isn't going to shrink to cover all those strands so you get a nice smooth finish. Let me show you what we did with Larry's L88. Well, what we would do here is once all the fiberglass work is finished on the car, we'd put the entire car into epoxy primer. That does two things. It holds down the strands of fiberglass, and that's a really good characteristic for the epoxy, and secondly, it's a nice base to work off of. We can do our filler work on top of that. And because this car, it looked like somebody had actually sandblasted the hood prior to us stripping it, all those resins had been blown away, and if you remember, the hood was really starting to crack all over the place when we took this car apart. So we have to deal with that, and what we did is use a polyester based filler, which is a very, very high temperature filler. It's good to over 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and that'll hold down all those fiberglass strands, and you won't see them popping later, and you won't see it crazing later. Especially important on places that take a lot of heat. The hood, you've got this L88 motor making huge horsepower underneath here and also creating a huge amount of heat, and that's one of the areas that you really got to pay attention to. Well, the next step is to put the entire car into polysurfacer. The epoxy protects the metal in the door jambs, holds down the strands of fiberglass, but you can't really block it and make it straight with that. That's polysurfacer's job. Well, when you start block sanding, most of the stuff is actually done by hand. You have a variety of different blocks. You have smaller blocks, bigger blocks. We actually make some of our own aluminum blocks, and then it comes down to sandpaper. Polysurfacer is there to actually straighten the car. So what we start with is 120 grit paper. Now with the Corvette, it's a fairly round car, so we're using a flexible board file. And then it's just a matter of blocking. And again, we put the black guide coat over top of the polysurfacer, and what that's going to show us is our high and low spots. Earlier with the hood, because the top of the hood is fairly flat, you're going to use a very flat file as opposed to this one here, which forms to the side of the car. It's a fairly round car. Now, one of the things we said, we're going to actually make this car a lot straighter than when it left the factory, but what we don't want to do is make all the edges nice and sharp. We want to actually round those off just the way it was from the factory. So it's really the center of the panel that we're concerned about keeping nice and flat. When you're filing a car or blocking out a car, you want to use an X pattern, just going back and forth, making sure you're keeping it straight both ways. And you see how much material this polysurfacer really builds up to. Now this is 120 grit, and you have to keep repeating this step. You go 180 grit, put a guide coat in between, then you go to 240, guide coat in between. You got to make sure that you get all of the edges in here real nice, all the wheel lips, all the contours around the bumpers and that. It's a fair bit of work, and this stuff here is pretty tough, so you want to make sure, like we showed you earlier, you don't put it in areas that you don't want to be trying to get it out of later. It's pretty tough to work with. The next thing we'll do is we'll put it into a high build primer. That'll be the final step. Then we'll start 320, 400, 600. If it's metallic color, we'll go to 800 wet, and then it's ready for paint. Well, the guys at Legendary Motorcar are working hard on the body of the Corvette, and I'm here with Mike Curley from Active Engines getting ready to assemble the L88 motor.
Okay, Pete. Well, I guess the first thing we'll do is put the cam in, okay?
When you're putting in a cam, I guess you got to pre-lube it and just be careful not to nick it.
Yeah, well, basically it depends on what kind of camshaft you're working with, Pete. In this particular case, we're using a roller camshaft, so you don't have to be as careful, but if it's a flat tappet cam, you want to make sure and use the proper brake-in lube on all the lobes and lifters.
The rear seal, you want it off about 10 degrees from the flat surface.
That's right. You don't want to mate the seal with the mating surfaces on the block.
Better chance of a leak.
That's right.
Let's do the bearings. And
okay, here's the main bearing, Pete. You want to put the locating dowel, line it up, and just sort of snap it in there.
Yep.
Okay, we'll put some grease on there. You want to have some, Pete?
And all this is pre-lube again?
Yeah, it's just a white lithium grease, and just ensures that we got proper lubrication on the bearing when we fire the motor up.
Okay. Ready to drop in the crank?
All right, grab the back end there, Pete. Just real careful like.
Just so we don't nick a bearing?
Yeah, you don't want to nick a bearing. Just let it down real slow and watch out for your seal there. And just, there we go. You in? There we go.
Yeah.
And just give it a little spin. So you always turn the crankshaft in the same rotation that it's going to turn when the engine's finished. Good. Okay, Pete, we're going to put the caps on. We're going to make sure that our locating lugs for the bearings are together.
Yeah.
We'll do the rear cap last.
Why do you do the rear cap last?
Because we're going to put a little silicone right on the parting lines of that seal just to ensure that it doesn't leak on us.
What do we set the mains at?
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to torque the mains down, but we're going to do it in steps.
Okay.
I think the first thing we want to do is set the thrust bearing, though, before. They're good and snug now?
Yep.
Pete, what we're doing here is we're going to set the thrust bearing. This is something that a lot of guys don't do, and then they wonder why, when they've got the main caps all tight, that the crank is stiff. And by doing this, what we're doing is we're lining up the thrust bearings so that they're together, so we have thrust clearance.
Okay. So give it a whack on that side?
Yeah, we'll give it a whack on this side, and now you do the same on the other side. Now we've already checked the thrust clearance, so we know that's correct. We're just doing this because we're going to torque the main caps now. Do the middle bolts first and then the outside bolts, and cinch them up evenly. You don't even have to go to 75 pounds first, just nice and even like. I'll hold the block for you. It's always important to make sure that you torque at the same torque as what the machine shop machined the bores at. In other words, if they torqued it at 110 pounds and you torque it at 90 pounds, the housing may not be round.
Ready to stick the pistons in?
Yeah, ready to go for pistons now.
Now that we got the bearings put into the rods, we're ready to assemble. Anything we should check?
Yeah, you want to first, Pete, check all the ring end gaps and make sure that your gaps are correct. If you don't get the gaps right, you're going to melt a piston or hurt the engine for sure.
Okay, and that's just a gap when it gets compressed, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the other thing you want to do is you want to offset all the rings so that none of the gaps line up, or else you're going to lose compression through those gaps.
So that's just strictly, you don't want to have the two gaps in the same place,
Like
because in the bore it's going to go right past the two.
Correct.
So
We
just
usually-
put them at 180?
That's right, 180 degrees off.
Okay.
Okay,
Fire
we're
away,
ready to
stick
put her
'em
in. Great.
So we're just going to torque the rod bolts and just go back and forth?
Yeah, just cinch them up evenly. Don't go right to your finished torque right away.
And then we'll just go back and check them all?
And we're going to double check, and we'll turn it around. And now what we're going to do before you torque it is we're going to make sure that these rods are floating freely on the pin. And you can see those move around nicely. And now just check the torque and make sure that you're at your desired torque. Perfect. Now we're ready to put the timing chain and gear set on. We've got the crankshaft turned to top dead center, and you can see the marks are lining up now. We've used the cam gear to turn the camshaft to the appropriate spot. We're now installing the cam gear on the cam and put a locking plate on it with a cam button, and then snug her all up, and we're good to go.
Good. What's the cam button do?
The cam button stops the camshaft from moving back and forth in the engine. We want it. It has to have some play, but we don't want it moving back and forth, or one of the lobes may actually strike the next lifter. And now we're going to bend these locking tabs over to make sure the bolts can't back out.
And then all we got left for the short blocks, just put in the frost plugs, and that's pretty much it, eh?
Yep.
Well, now the frost plugs are in, I guess next step is put in the oil pump?
Yeah, and what we do before we put the pump on, Pete, you can go ahead and put it on if you want, is we've disassembled the pump, we filled it up with white lithium grease, and also, very important, to check the pickup depth in the pan.
And you've measured all that?
It's already been done, and we're ready to go, and we're just going to install it and torque it.
Okay.
All right? Good.
You're going to put together roller lifters now, and this is just a bridge that goes in between. Is there anything special you do?
Well, you want to make sure that the bridge is on properly, that up is up.
Yeah.
You want to get lots of oil on the lifter. You want to make sure that it goes up and down the lifter bore freely and doesn't jam.
Okay. All right, we're ready to bolt the heads on, I guess. So
Yep.
you want to lift the heads on?
Now what we've done here is we put a Felpro stainless steel firing head gasket on here. We've made sure they're on the correct way, and we put the head down, making sure all the mating surfaces are clean. We're now going to get the head bolts and put the head bolts in and torque
them
down.
Okay, good. Okay, we're just going to start tightening them down and just even, and then you're going to torque it. And it's real important the pattern that you torque with, isn't it?
Yeah, different engines have different patterns. If you don't know the actual pattern for the engine you're working on, a good rule of thumb is start in the middle and work kitty corner and work your way out to the outside. Every different engine has a different spec for the torque, the actual torque. You may want to know whether they want the bolt to be put in with some form of lube or Loctite or something. And then head gasket type also determines whether or not you're going to have to retorque it or not.
Now that the heads are torqued down, we're ready to put in the rocker studs. Now, these aren't exactly stock rocker studs.
No. What we've done is we've gone to an ARP Pro fastener, and as you can see, the thread length on the exhaust stud is much longer than the intake. Now, with this aluminum head, when you're running this much spring pressure, there's a danger that you might pull the whole boss out of the head. So what we're doing is we've actually drilled and tapped the hole down further, and we use these long studs, and we grab more of the cylinder head, and then as well we're using a valve girdle or stabilizer to tie them all together, and that'll keep us from destroying the cylinder heads. These are all comp cams, valve train components. Comp was good enough to give us a complete valve train package. As well, we used on this engine build JE pistons. They're a custom piston manufacturer.
We're almost set now. We're ready to put the intake on, and you just have to put the balancer on.
Yeah.
And it went pretty good. What do you think?
Yeah, we did pretty good here. We're going to use an ATI balancer. We like to use their balancer. It's supposed to be the best balancers made. We're finishing up. You can put the intake on now, Pete. And we're going to use an AED, or an advanced engine design carburetor. These are custom built carburetors. I've had great success with them. They save us a lot of time when we go to the dyno.
The nice thing about getting a motor built here at Active Engines, just about every piece ends up on the dyno. They make sure it's tweaked, they time it, they set the carb up for us. I mean, we're ready to drop it in, and we know it's going to run nails as soon as it comes out of the box. So next week, we're going to work on the L88. We're going to hopefully get this motor ready to put in, get it painted a couple weeks from now, and hopefully we're driving it soon.
Sounds great, Pete. Thanks very much.
Well, there are a whole bunch of factors that go into a great paint job. One is obviously the equipment. Here we've got a state-of-the-art downdraft spray bake Gen 4 system. We've got a great bake cycle in this thing. We've got a great mixing room. We've got great dryers outside. Now this car here, after we did all the body work, we got it into the polysurfacer and then into the final primer. What we had to do is spend a fair bit of time blocking again with 320. Spend hours and hours blocking 320. That gets all of the fine scratches out of it. Then what we do is we go to 600 wet and then to 800 wet grit paper. This is going a metallic color, so if you go metallics, you want to have the really fine surface on the end. And if you look down the side of this, you can almost see it shining. You could almost buff this up for paint and have it come out pretty nice. The second thing we spend a lot of time with is masking off the car. Even though we have a state-of-the-art downdraft spray booth here, 95% of the dirt that gets into a paint job comes from either the car or from the painter himself. So what we do is we mask everything off here. We spend hours and hours. You can blow it out as many times as you like. You're still going to get some fine particles of dirt that as you go over it with the spray gun, it's going to get blown out onto the top surface, and that dirt is going to stay in the paint. So we've bagged everything off here. The next step is to do a final inspection over the car. Make sure all the edges have some primer on it, and then do a final degreasing, which takes any imperfections off the material, the body material itself. If I touch this right now with my hands, there's grease on my hands, there's oil on my hands that'll contaminate the paint. You'll actually see a fingerprint, might come out 6 months later, might come out 6 years later, but that oil is trapped underneath the paint. The last thing you do is use a tack rag, and then you're ready to spray. Now that the base coat is pretty much finished, we do one final inspection. And the thing that I'll insist my guys do is use a trouble light. And it'll show any of the areas that haven't been totally covered. And you can see one spot in here that there's a little bit of coverage missing. The other thing we're looking for is to make sure the metallic is nice and even. He'll go around with the trouble light, make sure it's 100%. It's worth the extra coat of paint now to have it perfect. The next thing we'll do is we'll add the clear, we'll add 4 coats. The next step after that is to actually bag off the entire car and get ready for all the detail work. Well, once the body's painted, that's only half the job. Now what we have to do is do all the parts. We have to do the hood, we have to do the doors, the valance, all the headlights around. A whole bunch of pieces are hung up in the booth, and you want to be careful that you get all those pieces in at once if you can, to keep the metallic nice and even. As these cars went down the assembly line, this is what we're trying to duplicate. The cars were primed, so you got a little bit of overspray onto the floor pans. Then what would happen is the cars got painted. As the cars got painted, again, you had a little overspray just on the edges of the floor pans. The rest of the floor pans were still raw fiberglass from the factory. So that's what we've duplicated here. We've actually sprayed a little of the overspray onto the floor pans, and then what happens is you get the blackout process in the engine bay. Obviously, they're not raw fiberglass after they leave the factory. So what they do is they mask off the body and they spray all the black in the engine bay, and they kind of mist it into the tranny tunnel and into the footwells here. And you can also see the original markings that we found when this car came apart. We've duplicated them as well. If you look at all the clips and things in here, when the car went down the assembly line, these clips were painted black and then they were riveted on. Now, we're not going to remove all of the rivets on this car, so what we did is we hand painted all of the clips and then hand painted all of the rivets to duplicate that original look. Now, once the cars got put together, body onto chassis and everything together, there was actually a blackout procedure that GM did, and they randomly sprayed underneath the car trying to make the whole thing look kind of black. Now, because Larry wants this car to sort of be above and beyond, and if you want maybe even an over-restored car, we're going to be very careful with the blackout procedure not to mess up some of the nice detail work that's happened on this car. And if somebody wants to show it later, make it an NCRS car, they've got to change a few things, but they can always go under there and do that blackout procedure at any time. It's not like we're doing something that can't be fixed later. Well, the guys here at Legendary Motorcar have been working awfully hard getting this chassis put together. And the whole premise of this thing was to make sure that this car looked 100% stock. So we went to Paragon Corvette, and what they've got is some great kits. Every single component you could want for this car in a bag, labeled. Nice and easy to order from, nice pieces when you get it, all concourse correct. NCRS accepts all these pieces, from battery cables to accelerator springs to all the little clips. All the hardware on this car comes in a bag labeled. Nice and easy to put together one of these cars. Now again, the premise of this car was to have it look stock but have some performance. Well, we have 650 horsepower out of this motor, and it's a 7,000 RPM motor, maybe 7,500 RPM, so we had to run a stud girdle. We had to make it look stock, so we cheated a little bit, and this is what we did. We're using a stock valve cover, but underneath that valve cover, we actually have a stud girdle. Now, because that won't fit, what we did is we had a spacer made up, and this spacer is made out of aluminum. It's kind of a neat part. We machined the ends of it so it fits flush to the head, and at first glance, you can't tell. It looks like it's part of the head. Nice little item here. We need this stud girdle, so we have to put this together. The second item we did is we went to an aftermarket carb. We've got a totally reworked race carb. Underneath the air filter, you'd never notice that this piece here is a race piece. Fits in nice, air cleaner covers it real nice. The fluid damp on this piece here, well, we left it the natural color, and we've got the markings here. Once the rad's in and all the hoses are in, you're never going to notice that. As far as the lines go on it, we went with classic tube stainless steel lines, and again, it's got a stock look, it's got all the correct colors on the fittings and that, but we get a little bit more performance out of them. We don't have to worry about them rusting from the inside. Now, suspension. We made sure everything looks stock on this, but it's got all urethane bushings in here. We've got a race spring in the front. We've painted it up, put the correct decal on to make it look stock. Same thing with the shocks. We've actually got a race shock absorber here, but we've painted it the stock blue-gray so it looks original. Now, the only thing that really doesn't look original on the suspension is the tie rods, and these are adjustable, and they don't have any real slop in them. They're just a little bit nicer to use when you're setting up the front end, and we've got a bump steer kit. If the car ever went to a show, it would take about a half hour to change this back to original, and nobody would be able to tell this front end has been modified, and it's going to work real nice. Brakes, well, these brakes on an L88 are actually really good. The only thing we're going to change on here is we're going to go probably to a hawk blue or black pad, depending how aggressive Larry wants to be with that, and stopping is going to be fine. It's got four-wheel disc brakes, it's got big rotors, it's got 4-piston calipers. These will be just fine. Now, the transmission with 650 horsepower had to be fairly stout. Auto Gear makes an M22 with all brand new gears, brand new bearings, and a little bit of a heavy-duty case that worked really slick for this application and still looks stock. The other thing that's kind of interesting, if you look at some of the detail on the frame, you'll see a lot of the markings, like the date code on that side of the frame and the OK on the front of the frame, upside down. What actually happened, these cars were assembled upside down on the assembly line, and then they were flipped over. So a lot of the markings are actually upside down. Now, the rear suspension is pretty trick on this car as well. Now, what we started with is these weld-in bungs for the toe adjustment. Instead of shimming the trailing arm, which is kind of tough and it's a bit of a pain, now you can screw it in and set it up real easy. Makes it life easier at the racetrack. You can convert it back from street use to race use pretty easily. The rear trailing arm, stock unit. Now, The camber adjusting rods have hymen joints, so they're much more accurate than the stock piece. Again, a lot easier to set up and a lot more accurate on the racetrack. You're not going to get them moving around. These pieces, though, if you were going to a car show, wouldn't take very long to swap out. The whole premise of this restoration is to make it handle and work and still look as stock as possible, and not decrease the value of this car by adding things that kind of hurt it. These parts are removable in 30 minutes. The rear leaf spring, it's a race leaf spring, but what we've done is taken apart, put the little pieces in between, and painted it silver blue so it looks like a stock piece. Nobody'd be ever able to tell the difference. Same thing with the shocks. These are race shocks, but we painted them silver blue. Looks stock again. You can also tell the detail on the rear end on this car. It is totally done to NCRS specs, other than, again, these pieces here. We've also, the other thing that we've changed a little bit is we've gone with a solid bushing, again, so the rear end doesn't walk around if you're cornering hard. The whole premise of this restoration is to have it looking stock, but performing maybe twice as good as original. Well, the guys last night here at Legendary Motorcar were working hard getting the body down over the frame. Frame was all finished, all the suspension's in it, everything's looking just right. Body's all painted, ready to come down. Now the trick to doing this, it doesn't matter if you do it in your garage. I mean, Paragon has a body dolly, so you can do this by yourself. You put a hoist in the middle of it, you drop the body down. You can do it on a hoist like this, or you can just get a bunch of guys, depending how many people you have around, to just set the body over top of the frame. There's a few tricks. Make sure that the center line of the frame is in line with the center of the body. As it comes down, you want the rockers of the body to go over top of the frame, nice and clean, so you don't want it scraping the sides of the frame. We spent a lot of hours making the frame just right. The other thing you want to make sure is that the wheels are centered in the wheel well. Again, there's lots of areas for problems to happen. As the body drops down over top of the engine, it can scrape that whole firewall if you don't have it centered just right. So spend a little bit of time, get a bunch of buddies so you have people in all sorts of locations looking for areas that are scraping on each other. On this car here, we had a little bit of an issue when we added those weld-in bungs for the rear trailing arms. They stick out a little bit further than the original bolts. They make it nice and easy to adjust, but they make it a little trickier to drop the body in. We have to be really careful as that got lowered down. Now, once the body is set down on the frame, there's shims. And originally, we marked the original shims on this body as it came off. And then on the jig we built, we added that height to it to make sure as we did all our body work, everything would fit. Now, as we start putting those shims back in, we're adjusting the doors to it. The easiest thing is to start off on this door here. The door and the fender aren't going to change position. You're going to see that these two shims should be at their lowest point. And then what you do is make sure that the door lines up nice and easy with nice and straight with the fender. Once that's done, now you're doing all your adjustment with the rear of the door using the body. And you can actually raise the body up and down, closing up the door gap, opening up the door gap as you need it with shims on the back mount. You can also do the same shimming the front mount. It'll actually bring the whole front of the car slightly up, which brings the back of the door slightly down. So you work between those two points and get the back of the door nice and even. That's how you set the gaps on a frame-off Corvette like this. Now, once that's done, we're going to put the hood on. And again, in order to adjust the hood, we might have to move the body up or down. So the next step is to bolt down the hood, make sure that it fits the body, and then we can move it up and down. There's a fair bit of adjustment on a Corvette. If you go to the back of this car right now, I can lift up on the back of this car and actually close up that gap 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch just by hand. So you can see these shims are real important. This is sort of the crux of Corvette restoration, and this is why Corvettes from the factory, if you look at a nice original paint car, half the time the gaps in the doors are horrendous, and somebody has to spend a lot of time tweaking them to make them just right. Well, now that the body's all down on the chassis and it's all bolted down, it's time for the assembly process. And the rest of it's like any restoration. If you take your time, lay everything out. We set everything out on a table here. Make sure all the components have already been detailed and set. You don't want to be running back to the sandblaster, over to the spray booth, putting on one item at a time. It'll waste a bunch of time. Now, Paragon supplied all the parts for this, so we know they're correct. The canister, they're right anodizing, the hoses, the hose clamps, all the vacuum hoses have the right markings on it. It makes life a lot easier when you're doing a ground-up restoration to get the right pieces. The key with any assembly process is to make sure you take your time. If you scratch something now, it's going to take a lot more time to fix it. So just slow down at this stage, take your time, and things will go together actually a lot quicker than you think. We're back at Legendary Motorcar, and we have to have this car ready for a show in about 7 days. We've got the interior left to do, we've got the trim left to do. The trim on this L88 Corvette is pretty straightforward. It consists of the chrome, the bumpers, the bumperettes, same thing with the rear, taillight panels, and then some stainless steel. Now the stainless on this car is again very straightforward. Instead of buying new pieces, we can buy everything from Paragon if we need to, but all the chrome or stainless was very nice in this car, so we sent it out, had it polished. The guys at Cambridge do a real nice job. Comes back looking better than new. As far as pieces again, we could order new door handles, but what we did is we had them sent out to Cambridge again, and these guys take it apart, give it back to us in a bag labeled with all the pieces. Now all we have to do is put this together, and the quality of the chrome is a little bit better than some of the reproduction pieces. Now as far as emblems go, these pieces from Paragon, their GM pieces are as good as GM pieces. There's no point trying to send these out, get them replated, make sure they do the black trim and stuff. Just not cost effective. So these pieces we got from Paragon. Things like the license plate frame, again, we sent those out, made sure they looked better than brand new. Larry on this restoration wanted to make this car look better than new, and that's exactly what he's going to get. If you remember the rear bumpers when we took this car apart, they were all wavy and there were a bunch of pits in them. So the guys at Cambridge had to spend a lot of time straightening out those rear bumpers. Well worth the effort. If you have a look at them now, you can look down the sides and you can see the difference from before and what they look like now. Now one of the tricks we'll use here when we're installing bumpers, if it's a small bumper like this Corvette, one guy can handle it. If it's a bigger bumper, you want two guys to make sure that you don't scratch the paint. One of the other things we do is we lay tape on the inside of the bumper and then use some foam around the edges. So if you slide it up into the place, if you move it around a little bit, there's no chance you're going to scratch the paint. Again, it takes a lot of time and effort to repaint a quarter panel if you scratch it. So take your time at this point. Then what you can do is you can tighten it down slowly. Keep in mind on fiberglass cars, if you reef it down or use an impact tool, you're going to actually crack that fiberglass. So take it easy, snug it down slow. Don't be aggressive here, it'll pay off in the end. One of the other pieces is trim. One of the tricks we use here is this piece of trim comes out of the bag and you see it's got these little cones here to protect it. Now they have to slide into the holes that were originally there. Now when you're doing all the body work, it actually builds up. You've got your poly surfacer, you got your primers, you got your final primer, you have your paint, you've got your clear. Well, that kind of fills in the hole, and now that hole is smaller than it should be, and what you can do is take a tiny file it out a little. If you just try and jam this end of the piece of trim right into it, there's a good chance you're going to actually crack the paint. And because you don't have much room on this piece here, if you crack the paint just a 1/4 of an inch, it's going to show behind this piece of trim. Take a look at a lot of show cars, you'll see they just jam this stuff on and it cracks the paint. So take a small file, open up the hole, and there's less chance that you're going to have that. You're also, if you ever have to remove this piece, you're not going to have the issue as you're pulling the piece of trim off, you're not going to have the paint come with it. Just a little thing that'll take a little bit of time and save you a lot of grief later. One other unique thing on a Corvette is some of the stainless around the windshield is actually painted, so it has to be prepped. And what you have to do is epoxy prime it, paint that, tape it off nice and neat, polish the edge on this piece, and then polish the paint itself. This is kind of unique to a Corvette. There's not a whole bunch of cars that do this. So if you take your time at this stage, this is usually when the paint gets damaged, slow down a little bit, it'll pay off in the end. Now this car doesn't have a lot of trim, so there's not a whole bunch of hours involved in this car, but take your time, it's worth it in the end. Well, today's interior day in a 1969 Corvette is not a super complicated interior. What we did is we got brand new seat covers. Gary at Diamond took apart the seats, put in new buns, it looks brand new. Carpeting, fairly straightforward. You just want to make sure that it's glued down properly so it lies down so there's no bubbles. The dash, we used the original dash. It was in mint condition. All we did is clean it. We happen to have a set of great original door panels. Again, all we did is clean them, installed them, made sure we put in all new hardware, door handles, the lock knobs, the window winders, made sure all the chrome for all the vents and all the pull knobs are brand new. Those are the details that make the interior look perfect. If you want to go to the extreme like we did with this, you want to make sure you've got a new rear view mirror, make sure you have all the plating done on the sun visors, and all the stainless and all the chrome should be replated. That's what makes for a great interior. Now, the interior, like I said, is fairly simple, but the convertible top takes an expert like Gary from Diamond Upholstery.
Peter, before the top comes off, there's a few things you got to check to make sure this whole job is going to go smoothly. Anytime you're working with a top that's over 20 years old, you got pins, guides, bushings that are going to wear out, so it causes the top to not work as good as it did when it was brand new. Peter, once the frame's on the car, there's a lot of adjusting to be done. Start with adjusting, trying to get back to the original points where the convertible top was originally mounted. We scribed a little line just to know where the frame originally started. It's a little bit of a time saver. It'll help us out, right? Then we go into latching mechanisms, make sure the top is functional up and down. Ease of operations is key here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to install the weather strips just temporarily, like we might have to adjust them one more time. We're going to fit the driver's and the passenger door glass to make sure the doors close easily and it's not hard to roll the window up and down. Anytime you're working with new rubbers, they're not always exactly as the original. If you want this top to look good, start with good-looking pads and you'll end up with a good-looking top. Pads serve a number of functions. They keep all the bows in sync, helps the top fold down properly, and it also it relieves the look of a skeleton here, so everything's nice and smooth. You have a nice consistent line going with it, and it helps the top up and down as you're folding it. The process of putting on pads, Peter, the pads come 2 flaps sewn on either side. They're installed on the back. Once you've secured the tacking strips, you staple down your liner pad. A piece of foam is installed in between the pad. Once you're happy with all the adjustments you made on the convertible top frame, your pads are all in place, everything's functioning up and down properly, we'll start to put the top on it. What we'll do from there, Peter, first of all, check the bow height. This height from the top of the rear bow to the bottom, absolutely critical. Different manufacturers have different bow heights for different tops. Once that's done, we're going to secure the rear anchor. The top's going to be tucked. There's a little filler strip, and then there's also a weather strip. That'll all be installed. We'll go to the front. We'll pull it, taunt on the front, install the filler strip there. It's all stapled there. And go back to the back. This is what it's called a wire-on. It's stapled across here, a couple little caps put on the end, and then we'll pull the sides. We'll wrap the sides, and once again do the final adjustment on the weather strips just to make sure that nothing's moved there. So then you've got a perfect fitting top that's functional and looks good.
If you'll remember back to the beginning of the season, our mission for Larry's L88 was to build the ultimate 69 L88 Corvette Roadster. Now, some of the parameters were the car was to look as stock as possible and have the ultimate in performance, both straight line, around corners, and braking. And this is what we achieved. We achieved the ultimate L88, and now we're going to compare it to a Bloomington certified top flight NCRS car. Can you tell the difference between this bone stock original car and Larry's ultimate L88 car? Well, at first glance, if you looked at the two cars side by side, the first thing you're going to notice is that Larry's L88 sits about 2 inches lower than our Bloomington Gold L88. We lowered the car a full 2 inches. That'll keep the center of gravity lower to the ground. It'll make for better handling. The second thing you're going to notice is the original L88 has a set of F70 Goodyear 15s. They're a redline bias ply tire, not a great handling tire. This car here, we actually did our testing with a Goodyear, a 245/45 17, and we had a custom 17-inch wheel. Now the Goodyears worked really well on the road. They didn't quite fill out the wheel well, so we ended up with a 255/45 ZR17. This tire works great too, and it fills out the wheel nicely. The last thing you'll notice on the exterior are the pipes. Now this car originally came with a set of pipes, Nick's L88 didn't. These are stock side exhaust covers. Now underneath those covers there's a trick set of mufflers. When we fire this car up finally, you'll hear the difference. Now let's look under the hood of these two cars and see if you can tell the difference in what we did under here. Well, at first glance, when you look under the hood of Larry's L88, it looks like it's ready to be judged at an NCRS meet. But then if you start looking closely, you'll realize there's a few tricks underneath here. First off, we put an MSD ignition system on. Still has the dummy vacuum advance like the stock L88s have. We tacked that underneath here. We've got an aftermarket coil, but we put the Delco Remy logo on it. Looks bone stock. All the rest of the engine bay, as far as heater hoses, radiator hose, original fan belts, the alternator, the brake booster, all of the vacuum lines are 100% original. They look stock. Now if you look close at the top of the motor, stock intake, which was one of the things that we insisted on, stock set of heads. But how did we get those roller rockers underneath the original set of valve covers? We actually machined a piece of aluminum so it looks like it's a piece of the head, painted the gasket with some silver paint so it looks like it's part of the head, and we've raised it up a full 1.5 inches so it would clear that stud girdle. Again, at first glance, looks bone stock. If you look down a little further, you'll see the headers. Now they're jet hot coated not a stock looking piece. On the original L88, it's got all the smog. We actually toyed with the idea of putting dummy smog tubes up to a smog pump, and their owner said it probably wasn't worth the effort. If you look further down than that, you'll see a 1/2-inch fuel line to feed this 650 horsepower L88. Stock ones came with a 3/8 fuel line. Then if you look at the rest of the engine compartment, it looks bone stock until you get to the front end of it. We've got an aluminum racing radiator here that we've painted black, stock type of paint, so it looks bone stock. We also added a shroud. Now the idea here, an original L88 did not come with a shroud, but what we wanted is for Larry to be able to drive this in California on a 110-degree day, sit there idle and make sure the car wouldn't overheat. This car is meant to be driven as well as taking it to the car shows. As you can see, the only differences under the hood are all subtle. How about the interior? Well, both interiors are 100% stock. They're original seat covers, original carpets, everything looks original. Soft top, same deal. The only difference is underneath the car. We started with a set of 700-pound front springs, detailed them to look original. Rear spring, 220-pound spring, again detailed to look original. Set of race shocks that have been detailed to look original, and a couple of Hyman jointed struts. Again, it looks a little bit different, but we could always paint them and make them look almost identical. Now the big thing, of course, is when you fire up the car. No stock L88 car sounds like this. Well, the guys at the Caledon Fire Department are a bunch of car buffs, and on a quiet Saturday afternoon, they were watching what else? Dream Car Garage. They were watching us build this killer L88 motor, and they figured the motor was so hot, they better be on hand when we take this for its maiden voyage. So that's exactly where we are, at the Caledon Fire Department. We're ready to take this for its initial run, shake it down, make sure everything works, and we got the fire department handy just in case. So let's take it for a spin. First thing you want to do when you're debugging a car is just take it really easy. You don't want to stand on it and have something come apart and end up in a ditch, especially when it's someone else's car. So what we'll do is we'll just go through all the gears, make sure that the trainee's working nice. This is a prototype trainee from Auto Gear. Seems to shift real smooth, but like I said, just break it in slowly. When we come up to our first stop, you want to ease into the brakes, make sure they're not pulling left or right, and again, it end up putting you in a ditch. At some point, you want to take it on a nice open road, let it breathe a little, make sure there's no tire shakes, make sure there's no vibrations through the motor, trainee, rear end, all that sort of stuff. You want to make sure all the switches work, like the heater. No time for that. You'll also want to check all the gauges. When we started with this car, everything worked but the clock, and everything's working again. That's a good sign. The other thing you want to do is idle around at low speed, because in traffic you want to make sure this car isn't going to overheat. When the temperature starts coming up on this, you see there's no issues at all. Just want to make sure, go through all the gauges, make sure the oil pressure is good, water temperature is good. The RPM seems to be about right. The mile an hour seems to have the right gear in the transmission. Then start going through all the mechanical items inside, turn signals, make sure they work inside, make sure they work outside. Back to the wiper motors, make sure they work. Generally on a road test, we'll take it on the back streets a little bit, make sure we don't get any stone chips on it, and take it for a good half-hour drive, making sure that, like I said, it doesn't overheat and doesn't do anything stupid. And at that point, we're ready to get on it just a little bit. Larry's left us instructions not to really beat the tar out of this car. So we'll take it up to 5,000 RPM. Again, make sure there's no vibrations, make sure there's no missing. And after that, Larry can beat on it as hard as he likes.